Hi everyone, delighted to be here running the session today. So yeah, just I suppose to introduce myself briefly, I'm a coaching psychologist and HR professional with a background in business kind of transformation and coaching people managers through change. So the vast majority of the work I do is around helping individuals, teams and organizations to thrive through change, really. And over the last number of months, a lot of the work that I have been doing is in the space with helping organizations, in particular, to kind of navigate the changes relating to the pandemic. So initially companies that needed to move everybody remotely quite quickly, or companies that needed to close and so on. So that's really, I suppose, the context for today. We're going to be looking at people planning as we kind of the post lockdown, really. I was trying to think of what's the best kind of phrase to use for that, but it's this point where we're slowly starting to transition into back to business, kind of the social and business opening up a little bit more. And it is a good time to take stock and kind of have a look at what's changing and what's going to make sense for you and your business going forward. So really, this is a 40-minute, very, very quick overview. And really what I want to do is kind of highlight that there are certain things that are really helpful for you to start to think about at the moment, and that there is help out there for those things. So really what we're going to be looking at, just go on to my next slide, is we'll have a brief look at kind of leading your team through change, and then move into looking at managing your people resources, specifically kind of looking at a bit of scenario planning, and talking down through some very brief overview of restructuring of options and some of your obligations as an employer. So as I said, really the focus is highlighting that these are helpful things to look at this point in time. There is help out there, whether it's myself from a HR point of view, somebody else from a coaching point of view, or employment law support, or also financial supports. But it is a good time to kind of take stock and have a look at these things. So if we look at leading your team through change, first of all, and sorry, actually, just to say before I go into this, you'll have seen from the intro that I refer to this as an interactive session. Really, the reason why I said that was because, there's so many different situations that people are going through at the moment. Like some of you will just be getting back to an office. Some of you are getting back to work after closure. Some of you have been working all along, but are looking at different strategies for your business. So really, if there's any questions that you have as we go through, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask, or you can throw it into the chat box. But I have left some time at the end to go through Q&A, because it's very broad, and if there's any specific queries that you have that you want to get out of it, do use this time to ask those questions, or of course you can follow up with me afterwards. But I've left time for questions, so do, if you have any, feel free to jump in. So when we look at leading through change, we really are, like, the change, I'm sure we've all heard the terms like the unprecedented level of change and so on. There has been so much change over the last number of months, and it's quite significant in terms of how it's impacting on individuals. I mean, if we look at but from March to today, the changes that has been happening, but then at this point at which people are starting to transition back to business, that's further change. And then if you're looking at needing to review your business strategies, then that there's further change associated with that. So that's why I felt it was helpful to have a brief kind of look at this. Anyone who was on the session last week will have seen this curve, which is really kind of looks at a bit of a Kubler-Ross change model, but also bridges, which is really helpful at looking at the psychological aspects of change. So taking into account how people feel when something is coming to an end, and that can be quite abruptly in terms of life as we knew it, coming to an end abruptly in March. It could be coming to an end of working from home at this point and transitioning back in. That at that time people can often feel quite shocked, in denial, perhaps a little bit sad, and then moving into kind of a neutral phase where there isn't really anything happening, and people can feel, I'm sure many of you on the call have felt over the last number of months, a bit sort of confused and perhaps a bit skeptical about when things are going to change, or when you're going to see differences, and then the new beginnings where people can start to feel excited and energized. So this is just helpful to understand broadly the context of how the psychological response to change, but it's something for you to think about when you are, if you're planning any changes in your business over the next number of months, that this doesn't just apply to massive pandemic related changes. This is really to do any change and helping people to, I suppose, process change. But from a people manager point of view, from your own perspective, is to think about people can be at completely different stages of this, I suppose, this curve at any given point in time, and just to bring that awareness. You know, I'm really quite fond of it really resonates with me, the phrase that's been used over the last number of months that, you know, we're all in the same storm but not in the same boat. Like, people are having such vastly different experiences of the pandemic, and as they will as getting back to work. And if you are changing the way that you operate as people come back to work, they can have vastly different views about that as well. So it's just really helpful to kind of keep that in mind in how you lead people through change. And so within that, then, some of the very key pieces, and I won't dwell on this, but, you know, acting with care and compassion, it's just so important. I talked about this a lot last week, and it's something that comes up again and again, and an awful lot of the publications over the last few months around leadership through the pandemic have really heavily focused on compassion. And that is that piece about, you know, not making assumptions about what's going on for people. Try and get out and talk to your people, and understand that there's lots of different circumstances for people out there. Early engagement and communication is key. So what I'm talking about here is if you're planning any changes in your business, you know, it's completely understandable that there are going to be changes for so many different teams and businesses, whether they've happened already or more changes kind of coming down the line. So as I said, you know, even if you don't have anything in particular to communicate to people, it is better to tell them that you don't have any update than leave them kind of guessing and filling in the gaps. And where you can involve your team in the solution. So you may not necessarily know what you need to do in your business, but talk to them and see, do they have ideas, you know, any suggestions, or just getting them involved where possible in your solution. And being flexible to adapt to changes, look, that's so important at the moment. You know, we'll have seen on the news yesterday, there was lots of businesses planning on reopening on Monday, and now that's not going to happen. And if we think about the impact that perhaps they were bringing their employees back from layoff and so on. So there's an awful lot of changes outside of our control. So trying to build flex into your plans. And knowing your employees' rights, which we'll come on to, is really important, that you know as you're going through what decisions need to be made. Okay, so if we look at managing people resources then, so this is really looking at, okay, you know, you're at a point now, obviously there was a need to make very quick decisions back in March. Perhaps you've managed to map out your strategy over the last while or not, but really if you're looking ahead, thinking about how can you manage your people resources going forward. And an awful lot of this is down to scenario planning. So looking at what is the, I suppose, when you look ahead to the short, medium and long term, what's the best case scenario for your business? What's the worst case scenario, and then what's really the most likely thing that's going to happen. So taking time to map that out for yourself is really helpful. And so if we look at some scenarios, and this is not an exhaustive list, it's just an example of some of the things that have come up in the work that I've been doing over the last while. You know, things around forced temporary closure. So anyone, if there's anyone on the call or anyone watching afterwards that had planned to reopen on Monday and now that's not the case. So thinking about that, that's very much a short term at this point, but how does that impact on the medium term? So looking at if there's a significant reduction in your workload temporarily, or perhaps that's going to go on for the foreseeable future. That's different, you know, there's different kind of plans needed in there. Perhaps you need to completely diversify your business offering, or you did over the last number of months, and now you're looking at where is the future for your business. Perhaps you have issues where you're really busy, but your staff are not available for work. That's something that's coming up a lot, where people, for example, people that don't have any childcare and aren't able to come to work, or you ideally would have people work from home, but there's a limited ability for them to do that. And then some other pieces are around, you know, perhaps you're really busy, but you've cash flow problems. So these are all different scenarios that it's worth sitting down, I suppose, just even by yourself for a few minutes and working through when you look ahead, let's say in the next month, the next 6 months and into the next year, what are those best case, worst case and most likely scenario for your business? So when you're kind of getting a little bit more clarity around that, then you're looking at, okay, so I suppose the most important thing here is always bring it back to what is your business need. That is the most important thing. At the end of the day, that's how you need to make a decision. So I say that because I have been dealing with people over the last while that have been trying really hard to accommodate all their employees as best they can. But that should really only come after you've looked at what is my business need? How do I make sure that my business is sustainable, that it's it's doing what I need it to do? So when you're focused on the business need, you're starting then with what is the work that needs to be done. That's your starting point here from a people resources point of view, and mapping that out. So as you look ahead, what work needs to be done, and then you move down to who is in your business. And so that might be people who are employees in your business, perhaps contractors, stakeholders, service providers, yourself. So looking right across and seeing who are the resources that you have available to you. And then there's a piece of kind of a matching exercise around, so who is able to do what work? And so perhaps the work is staying very similar to what was there before. It might be on a reduced basis. When we talk about these vastly different scenarios, I know lots of companies that are actually really busy through this, and so they need to increase the resources available. But you're looking at, you're basically looking at your skills and experience mix in terms of who you have available to you in your business. And then looking down into how, where and when can the work be done. So obviously over the last number of months there's been a big focus on remote work. That may or may not change as we look ahead to the coming months. So this is a good time to look at, okay, as you are able to kind of reopen things and business gets I suppose back to some semblance of normality, does it make sense for you to continue to have people working from home or working remotely? The next then is looking at, are your resources available to meet this need? So that's that piece that that I've mentioned there. And that, so you might look at, okay, this is the work I need to get done. I have these resources available. They have the skills and experience to do the work, but then they're actually not available for a period of time. So that, that drives you back to needing a bit more of a short-term plan to address that. And then the other piece to look at is, what support do they need to be able to meet the business need? And so, say for example, something that's been coming up a lot recently for retailers is obviously there's a completely different way of doing business for them. From a health and safety point of view, all the additional PPE and equipment and changes to policies and procedures, the employees that work for them need support in order to know what these changes are and what they need to do. So that's in the context of they need some training, they need some guidance, they need new policies and procedures. So taking the time to look at what support do your team now need based on anything that's changing as you move forward. Okay, so really then that's looking at what is your business need over the next while. And as I said, we could be looking at a case where you expect to be really, really busy over the next while. So say, for example, if we look at hairdressers who are all most of them are really, really busy at the moment, and then they may not necessarily know how that's going to translate down the line. So perhaps you did a bit of a pivot in your business, and the product that you're providing at the moment is very relevant to the pandemic, and so you might find that you're really busy, or perhaps the work that you do broadly has really taken off over the last number of months. So you could be looking at how do you restructure for growth, for example, or for change. But you could also be looking at what you want to do in your business is vastly different from what you've been doing before, so you now need to look at sort of redeployment from a resources point of view. Or you could be looking at, when you do that scenario planning, and knowing what you know now, that you can't really see a point where you're getting back to where you were previously, and you need to make some sort of downsizing decisions. So this is what I talk about when I say it's broad. It's really a full remit of situations that I'm coming across people planning at the moment, and each will have its different method and way of looking at it. Oops, I've gone a bit too far. Okay, so if we're looking at the nature of the work is changing, So really this brings us back again to, okay, so you know the nature of the work and the business need is changing. So it's then having a look at, right, what is specifically the work that needs to be done, and who can do this work. And so really this is where we're getting down into focusing very heavily on the specific work before we look at who can do the work. So let's say, for example, if I stick with a hairdresser theme for now, just as we go. So if you had previously in a salon, you had people doing stylists, people doing colour, perhaps juniors, and then as you reopen, you really only, with the way that things are opening, you really only need stylists back in your salon. Then the work that needs to be done, it's just stylist work. So not everybody would be able to do it. So that's really what I mean here. You might be looking at retraining and redeployment of individuals. So it could be retraining them to do a different role as you're kind of getting back to business, or redeploying them into an entirely different role altogether. Another thing that's coming up an awful lot is around the need to vary terms and conditions of employment. And so this could be the case where you do, if you're looking for somebody to do a different role from what they did for you previously, that would involve changes to their terms and conditions of employment. But also if you're having different opening hours or different shift patterns, or if working from home is going to become a very definite feature in the future, and something that you want to put into have contractual requirement. So this piece is really important, because when we're looking at varying terms and conditions of employment, you always need to get agreement from your employees to vary terms and conditions. And so when we look at who's in your business, I suppose where that's relevant is looking at your mix of, perhaps you have employees, you might have some people who are independent or self-employed contractors, and there is a distinction here, because if you're looking at employees and you want to change any aspect of their contract of employment, you need to seek their agreement in order to do that. And then the other piece which we'll come on to is around you know, perhaps you're looking ahead and you realize, right, you know, things aren't going to change over the foreseeable. You may need to make some redundancies. Or while we won't go into it in great detail today, it's important to note that there are very specific procedures that need to be followed if you are making roles redundant in your business. And very much the starting point there is that looking at, you know, what's the work that needs to be done? You know, are there roles that are no longer needed in your business? And in that case, the roles are being made redundant are redundant, and you may have employees that are therefore at risk of redundancy. So it's a very specific process where it's a role that's that is redundant rather than an individual. But we can kind of come on to that around the Q&A if I'm talking about different things that come up. Some other pieces that might come up or may have come up over the last while are around financial constraints. So perhaps this is something that's relevant for you if you closed. You possibly had people on layoff over the last number of months. You may have just been bringing them back. Or again, when you look ahead to the next number of months, you may need to lay off some of your people temporarily or put them on short-term working. And so just to say, these again are very specific things that you may look to do based on the business need. You know, layoff is essentially, like, if we look at what's different between making somebody redundant or laying them off or putting them on short-term working, where they're redundant, that's a role no longer exists for the foreseeable as you look into the future, and so that has an impact that an individual is subsequently made redundant. Where someone is on layoff, it's essentially where you pause their contract of employment. So they're still your employee, but it's paused and they're not working for you during the period of layoff. So it's a difference between ending employment and pausing it. And I think in this country we don't help ourselves, because often those terms are used interchangeably. And then short-term working is where somebody has their hours have reduced significantly. And so I do have at the end of this a resources section, but your first port of call if you're looking to find out more on this is citizensinformation.ie. has great information about definitions of redundancy, layoff and short working, and some of the conditions that need to be met in order for you to do that. So specifically with layoff or short working, there will be a a clause in your employment contract that allows for that. Now, obviously, over the last number of months, that hasn't been the case for everybody, and some companies have needed to lay people off. But looking at how to make sure the correct paperwork is in place. Other things that companies may be considering based on financial constraints are around perhaps a temporary reduction in pay. That's something that I've come across quite a bit as well. And it's something just to be very careful about, because if you're looking to reduce pay, even if you're looking to do it across the board, that is varying somebody's employment contract, and you need to get their agreement. And so let's say if you did feel that, okay, when I look ahead, the best course of action here would be that everybody takes, say, a 10% pay cut, you need to very clearly communicate with your employees the duration at which you intend to do that for, and get their agreement to do it. Their agreement here is really very important. Another piece I have in the resources section is around seeking out financial supports that are available to you. There is an awful lot of supports out there depending on the type of business you're engaged in. There may be some of you on the call that availed of the temporary wage subsidy scheme. That's still in existence, and the link will bring you to some information on that. But there are different types of grants depending on your business. So if you feel that you're needing to make decisions based on financial constraints, do look and see what possibly is there for you. And yeah, do you need to make changes that result in redundancy? I mean, really, when we look at redundancy, it should be treated as the last option. It's the least preferable option. And as an employer, you really should look to do everything that you can to avoid redundancy. And so that could involve temporarily laying people off. It could involve reducing the hours across the board for people. It could involve a temporary reduction in pay. But if you do find that, okay, I've looked at all these options, but I do also need to reduce the number of headcount within my business, then it's back to that piece that I mentioned about, it's really, you're making roles redundant. So you could find a situation where a role no longer exists in your team or organization because of the pandemic and the way you need to do business going forward. And so then the people who do that role for you, they're at risk of redundancy, and ultimately may go on to be made redundant. You may also find that, okay, let's say, for example, I have 10 people that do the same work for me in my business, and when I look at my business plan going forward, I really only can see that I need 6. And so then if everyone is doing the exact same role for you, then everyone is at risk of redundancy in that situation, and then you'll have 4 people leaving your business on a redundancy basis. So I'm saying that because I really want to emphasize that it is a case of that you're looking at the business need, what roles are no longer needed, and then you're looking down to individuals. I'm happy to take any questions when we get to the Q&A piece around redundancy, because I don't want to kind of bombard you with the kind of rules and the guidelines around it, but they are very specific if you're making people redundant. So I'd say in that case, absolutely go to citizensinformation.ie as your first port of call. But if that's something that you feel that you need to do with your business, I'd highly recommend that you get HR guidance, employment law guidance before kind of implementing those decisions. Okay, so moving on very briefly to some kind of employer obligations. So this is really looking at as you transition post-lockdown. And so, when we look back to the beginning, and I mentioned about treating people with care and with empathy, generally I find a good rule of thumb is in all the decisions that you want to make with your business, if you can say hand on heart that you're treating people with respect and fairness and trust and compassion, and you're checking that with yourself all the way through, well then you're highly unlikely to go wrong. Then usually decisions can be made that can lead to people being in hot water because they haven't taken the time to think about, okay, well, how would this impact on the individuals concerned? If this was me, what information would I want to know, or what would be helpful for me? So, but some of the things to consider, let's say you're reopening, or you're getting people back to work, or business is picking up again. Some of the situations that have been coming up for people are where resources are ill or they can't work. I do have in the resources there some information to help with that, but one that's coming up an awful lot at the moment is people can't work because they have no childcare, for example. And so there has been, you know, if you look on Citizen Information or Revenue or the Workplace Relations Commission, there's all across the board is a request to try and work with your employees to find a way that works. And so in some cases that may result in waiving the notice period for some unpaid leave, some parental leave or so on, or coming up with some kind of workable arrangement. If your resources are continuing to work from home, we touched on this in more detail last week, but there are some very, very specific considerations if you're going to have people working from home for the medium to long term, particularly around kind of health and safety and say working time regulation. And so whereas it may have been okay in an emergency and in a pandemic situation to have people working from their kitchen tables, if it's going to be more long term, that's not feasible. You're going to need to review that. If you're having resources returning after being laid off, some of the things that have been coming up there is around what if people don't want to come back to work, if they don't feel ready, if they don't feel safe, and so on. So if anyone has any questions on that, feel free to ask me. And something that's coming up a lot is, that need to vary terms and conditions of employment, because so many businesses at this point need to change their opening hours, need to change what people are doing, you know, perhaps redeploying them to a different role and so on. And then some other pieces to think about are the new policies and practices that are needed. And so depending on the type of business, I've come across lots of really quite small businesses that may not have had detailed contracts in place previously. And if that's the case, now is a really good time to make sure that you have a very solid, robust employment contracts in place. Some other things that are very relevant are health and safety. Well, you know, there's this need to do that from the return to work protocol anyway, but making sure you have very detailed health and safety policy guidelines, documents and so on. But other things very helpful to have are like a grievance procedure for if your employee is not happy about something as they return, a disciplinary procedure if people aren't doing what you need them to do. So that's just, you know, it's taking the time to think about, is there something that I haven't actually had before that would be really, really helpful for me to now have as we kind of go through this transitionary period. Okay, just do a quick time check. Okay, so look, I will do a bit of a wrap up as we get to the end, but really, you know, this is your kind of opportunity. If there's anything in particular that you're wondering, as I said, that what I'm talking about today is really very broad. I'm very conscious that there's lots of different scenarios that people may be in at the moment. But if there is anything that you want to ask, feel free to come off mute and ask, or if you want to throw it into the chat box, I'll pick it up. So I'm just going to pause there for a minute and give people a chance if there's anything that you want to ask. Okay, so as I said, look, that's a really kind of brief overview, and really it's more just to draw your attention to some of the things that, you know, are useful to think about as we kind of transition post lockdown. You know, I know we did get news yesterday, obviously things have kind of put a little bit of a pause on it until August, but I think no matter what, even within that, there's so many different scenarios for different businesses over the next while. So I'd really recommend taking the time to do that scenario planning, you know, looking at that sort of short, medium and long term for your business, and, you know, in that need to be flexible, you know, what is the best case, worst case and most likely scenario. And so, for example, you know, for anyone that was planning on opening on Monday on the 20th and now can't, if we're looking back at that, what would have been really helpful for them is having a, you know, what's the worst case scenario? We get very late notification that we're not able to open, and what do we, you know, and having a plan for what do we do in that situation. Best case that we do open. Now, I'd say unfortunately, if people had been mapping that out a number of weeks ago, they probably would have thought most likely, given our trajectory, that they would have opened, but at least there would have been a scenario then for what would have happened, what we got news of yesterday, that people can't open. So and so that's over the next number of months. But if we look ahead then beyond that, so say do that kind of initial scenario planning over the next while, but then do take the time of thinking about, like, this presents a good opportunity to, I suppose, start afresh in some respects, you know, when you're reviewing your medium to long-term plans. And a big piece there is around, you know, working from home. If you've been able to accommodate working from home over the last while, how has that worked for you? Many organizations have found, you know what, this is really great. Or maybe not even working from home, but having people working remotely and working from different locations has worked really well for them. Or, you know, perhaps you did a bit of a pivot and it's worked really well. So taking the time then to look at your more longer term plans and making sure that you're building a sustainable resource plan. And so looking at the kind of down the line, longer term sort of organization design, you know, doing what you can to have a plan that the people that work in your business can be flexible and have transferable skills. You know, now is a good time to think about what would they need, what support would they need to be able to do numerous roles in your business for you, you know, to get that required flexibility. But also thinking about, you know, going forward, is there a better employee self-employed contractor mix that might work for you, or perhaps outsourcing some of the work somewhere else? It's just taking the time to think about that. Okay, I'm just going to go in to have a look at a question here. So are there any legal requirements we should be aware of getting back to work? Read about needing signage, social distancing guidelines. But that's taken care of for us by Iconic. Yeah. Are there other things we need to know about? And just a comment, I'm just going to read this out and then I'll answer it, that since our office space is rather small, even if we transition, say, 50% of our staff back in, we'd still be working back to back simply due to space constraints, which wouldn't work with distancing requirements. So there's a bunch to manage there. Yeah, I mean, the legal requirements, I mean, look, there's the government guidelines, there's the return to work protocol, I'd say is your first, looking at the return to work protocol is the first port of call, because it really depends on the type of business that you do and the type of business that you provide. You know, a lot of companies are going to need signage for sure. A lot are going to need way more than that. They're going to need PPE, and even from yesterday there'll be further requirements. So I'd say looking at the government, you know, keeping it, I don't know if I have it in the resources, but if not, you know, if you go to gov.ie, if you look at return to work protocol, you'll get the relevant piece for your industry there. I'm just going to have a look at some others. Somebody's asking, for medium to long term working from home, would you advise we hire a specialist to review the home workplace setup? Any idea what would be involved? And would you have any advice for staff that don't feel safe coming back? But can't come back to work? Okay. In terms of hiring a specialist, yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is, you know, like, I think we've been operating in a point where everybody needed, where they could work from home, there was the urgent requirement to have people working from home. And so, you know, I'm sure we've all seen lots of pictures of people using an ironing board and so on for, you know, for calls and for working. And so that's been fine in a kind of urgent situation. But if you're looking at it more long term, you really do need to make sure that you are adhering to health and safety regulations. And so, say for example, I think it was said there about with the likes of Iconic and co-working, that's an awful lot of that is covered. But if you do intend to have people working in their homes for a long period of time, you will need to fully review this. And so I'd say if you can, a specialist, yeah, you know, I don't actually know anyone who's doing it, but I do think if you've a lot of people in that situation, because you would need to review each space separately, it potentially is something to have a look at. And then advice for staff that don't feel safe coming back. I'm not sure about that, but can't work from home. Okay, sorry, yeah, I get it. So anyone who doesn't feel safe coming back but can't work from home. Okay. So yes, and this has come up quite a lot. You know, for people that don't feel safe coming back, it's really, you know, when we talk about leading through change here, as the people manager, it's about taking the time to understand what are their concerns, what is it that they're not feeling safe about, you know. And so, like, if you are, as an employer, following the government guidelines, following the return to work protocol, you're putting all your health and safety measures in place, if they're concerned about those, their health and safety as they come back, then it's making sure that they're fully aware of that. You'll probably have been training them on it anyway, that you're doing absolutely everything that you can to make sure that you're adhering to government guidelines and keeping your employees and your customers safe. That kind of resolves a lot of the concerns when they see the extent, because so many employers are doing so much, even more above and beyond. If it's about their own health and there's a concern about whether they can come back, so if they're at risk, I would say, for them, the first protocol is for them to speak with their GP. Perhaps it isn't good for them to come back at this point, but that's really medical guidance, and take that under consideration. So really, yeah, look, it's breaking down what is it that they're concerned about. I mean, you don't, if somebody is fit to be in work from a medical point of view, and they don't have, they're physically able to come back to work, so it's not that they have childcare or elder care reasons that they can't come back. Once you've taken the time to go through all the guidelines and the updated policies and procedures you've put in place, and try and reassure them, like, if they don't come back, you're not obligated to pay them. So this is where I would say start with trying to understand what the situation is. But if somebody should be coming back and they don't come back, there is a piece there where you could get to a point where they're frustrating their contract. So once you're doing everything that is required of you as an employer, and they're well enough to come back, and they don't have a specific reason that they can't come back, well, then you should expect them to come back. And that's fine. Working from home, like an employee, as an employer, you're not obligated to accommodate somebody from working from home either, unless it's specifically outlined in a contract. So that's something that's kind of been coming up a little bit. I'm just looking at another one that's come up there. What if people can't come back into work physically due to childcare, education, or underlying health illness, but can work remotely? Oh yeah, does your company have a legal obligation to accommodate for employees, or can they point back to the employment contract? Yeah, so if we're talking about, do they have a legal obligation to accommodate somebody to work remotely? Well, the answer is no, unless it's specifically covered in the contract. But as I said, there is a big ask on employers at the moment to try and work with your employees to find solutions. And so, like, there is a piece here where we're looking at, if people can't come back to work for childcare reasons, you're looking at potentially issues under equality legislation there, underlying health illness. To me, that's down to, is somebody, based on what we know, is somebody fit to be in work, given what the work environment constitutes at the moment? And so, I'd be seeking occupational health guidance in that context. But I suppose it depends what way we're looking at it. If we're looking at it from an employer point of view, you're not legally obliged to accommodate somebody to work from home. But I would say do what you can to try and reach some agreement, whether it's on a temporary basis that they continue work remotely temporarily, or that they take some special paid leave or unpaid leave, if it's childcare reasons, parental leave, for example. But trying to find a way to make it work over the short term, and then kind of looking at the more long term. Because if it is childcare or education, we're really talking about, hopefully, fingers crossed, a relatively short period of time. If it's an underlying health illness, I'd be taking medical guidance on that for sure. So, okay, any other questions from anybody? Okay. Okay, well, look, if anybody does, have any questions afterwards, feel free to get in touch. As I mentioned, in terms of the areas that I work in, I'm a coaching psychologist, so I'm working very much in the coaching space in terms of coaching for leadership, but also HR consultancy. So if anybody does have any particular areas in this that they would like some more support, please feel free to reach out. My website is strengthwithin.ie. You can get me at claire@strengthwithin.ie, and also you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. So do feel free to get in touch with me.